About 30 years ago, I was working across the country, but mostly in the South, with an organization called the Southern Coalition on Jails and Prisons, run by Reverend Joe Giarratano. And in that pursuit, I met a woman by the name of Marie Deans, who had worked with the Southern Coalition, and then left to form the Virginia Coalition on Jails and Prisons. Marie and I struck up a relationship, and at one point in the probably middle 80s, she asked me to come to Virginia to meet a particular client, I guess you would call him, of hers. And I had a trip to D.C., so I came over to Richmond and met with Marie, and she took me to meet Joe Giarratano, a young man who was then on death row in Mecklenburg prison in Virginia. Joe, she had met, she'd become very impressed with him. The process they went through was, I thought, quite extraordinary. She found him, I don't know how long after he'd been convicted and sentenced to death, on death row, pretty passive. He was on, I believe, Thorazine, one of the drugs that they use sometimes to keep people who are problematic quiet. Joe was suicidal. He was very deeply depressed. He'd been convicted of killing two women, raping one, a mother and daughter, and he was not in good shape. And Marie encouraged him to, he also was not challenging his conviction. And Marie encouraged him to, one, get off the Thorazine, stop taking the Thorazine that they were trying to give him, to clear his mind, and to be a little more thoughtful about his situation. She finally did convince him to do that. She found him to be then, once he was off the drugs, quite a bright young man, if not well-schooled, and convinced that he was guilty of a terrible crime. The story, as she began to understand it, was that Joe had left his home in Florida under very difficult circumstances when he was 11 years of age, already a drug and alcohol abuser. He wandered the country, ended up in Virginia, was working as a waterman near Norfolk, Virginia, living in Norfolk. And because of his abuse of drugs and alcohol, he suffered blackouts. He was living with the two women who ended up dead in an apartment, and suffered a blackout, came out of a blackout I presume one morning, I don't remember if it was morning or night, and found them both dead. Believing himself to be evil, believing himself to be worthless, Joe assumed he had committed the crime. He fled the scene, and of all things tried to go home, as I understand it, but at any rate decided finally that this was the wrong step, and he walked up to a policeman, got off a bus, walked up to a policeman and said, "I think I just killed two women in Virginia." He was already out of the state. The authorities took him into custody, contacted the Virginia police, who were at that time pursuing another lead in the killing. They came, they sat with him in the cell, they talked to him at length about the crime, at such length that he kept telling them, they asked him how he did it or what he did, and he would, I believe, make things up because he had no memory of it. And the police kept telling him, well, it couldn't have been done that way. He said, well, then they gave him some ideas, and he changed his story. He signed, as I understand it, 5 different confessions. There were 5 different confessions. Finally, they had agreed upon one, and to which he agreed, and he was taken back to Virginia, put on trial, convicted and sentenced to death for the murder and rape of these two, murder of 2 women, rape of 1. and tried to kill himself at one point in custody. I'm not sure if it was before or after the trial. So Marie saw this wretch of a human being who was in despair, kind of self-destructive, clearly, but also found in her, as she was wont to do, found a spark of humanity in him, and she encouraged him to get off drugs, which he did, and began to talk to him, and felt that given her understanding of this young man who began to appear, that he wasn't a violent person, that had he done this crime, he would have had no history of violence. So she decided what she wanted to do was appeal to the government. The basis on which he was convicted in Virginia, you'd have to have, as in most states, you have to have an aggravating circumstance for the conviction to demand or allow capital punishment. And the aggravating circumstance in this case was future dangerousness. So Marie decided that she would look into, if she could, look into Joe's past and see if there was any indication of his being dangerous, and if she could challenge the future dangerousness aspect of the conviction, perhaps get him commuted to life in prison rather than the death penalty. She hired a former police officer. She was given some money by a woman. There was a documentary film made, I guess, about Marie's work. And in part, the documentarians, who were Germans, I think, saw her working with Joe. And a woman who saw the film subsequently contacted Marie and said Joe struck her personally. She said, he could have been my son, and she wanted to help. So she gave Marie some money, which was hard to come by at the Virginia Coalition, but enough money, Marie thought, to hire an investigator to look into Joe's past. The investigator, a former police officer, looked at everything, looked at the trial transcripts, looked at the evidence, looked at Joe's history, and came back to Marie and said, you want my conclusions? And she said, yes. Can we attack the future dangerousness aspect of his conviction and hopefully get him commuted to life? And he said, well, first things first, what about the fact that he's not guilty? And she was astonished. She said, what do you mean, not guilty? And he said, the facts at the scene of the crime, the confessions, everything, the evidence, nothing adds up, and that this young man, in my view, did not commit the crime. Well, this put Marie onto a whole different path, as one might imagine. And it was at that point that she contacted me, among other people, I'm sure, asked me to come and meet Joe, which I did. And I had been in death rows prior to that time, but the lore, I would say, is that you hear people say, well, they all say they're innocent. I found that not to be true. But in this case, Joe didn't say he was innocent. When Marie and I met him, he said, I was blacked out. I don't know what happened. But he said, if the evidence suggests that I didn't do it, I'm certainly willing to go to trial and have them present all the facts and either convict me or free me. But he said, I can't tell you that I didn't do the crime because I don't know. At that point, I thought, well, this is quite an extraordinary person. Here he is in manacles and shackles and living on death row, and he's a young man with a quite extraordinary mind that had been developed in the years that Marie had known him then, to the point where he was demonstrating a real native intelligence and a growing sophistication based on reading that she was encouraging him to do. So getting involved with the case, Marie's point to me was she had, in Virginia at that time, they had a rule, a law actually, that suggested that if new evidence in a case was not brought to the court within, I believe it was 23 days after conviction, it was not relevant. It would not be admissible. So everything she had tried legally, everything the lawyers that were trying to help Marie with this case, and I suppose others tried to do, was deemed insufficient to the court. So it was what they called procedurally defaulted. They wouldn't simply allow new evidence, new consideration of evidence to be taken seriously. So she said, what we need is a public campaign. The only course of action available to us is to appeal to the governor, then a man by the name of Douglas Wilder, to take a look at the case, see the injustice here, and see if we can get him to free Joe, commute the sentence, do something to save his life. Well, that began a long, years-long campaign in which I traveled to Virginia many times and met with Joe many times and got to know the man and got to appreciate his fine mind and his really good heart, and believe very seriously that he was not a guilty man, and that something needed to be done. So I tried, and with Marie and with others we recruited into the cause, we engaged a tremendous number of people, politicians, journalists, people in the state, people out of the state, to have an understanding of the case, at least to the degree that they were willing to contact the governor and say something must be done to save this young man's life. His death sentence was coming to a point where he was going to be executed for a crime we believed he did not commit. Over time, I recruited a lawyer with whom I had taken a trip to the Middle East. Marie had lawyers working on the case. It was quite an amazing, actually, array of individuals, some very well-known, some not well-known at all, but all dedicated to this idea that this young man, who was, in our view, innocent, should not be executed. And it came down in 1991 to a matter of hours. I remember visiting Joe just hours before he was to be executed in the holding cell, death row, Virginia's death row's holding cell where he'd been moved, which was a matter of feet from the execution chamber itself. And going over the strategy. We had had meetings with the governor's legal counsel. We'd had meetings with everybody we could think of. We'd had petitions. We'd had press conferences. We'd had every avenue of approach to the governor we could possibly imagine. In fact, I had been told at one point, this young lawyer that I had recruited and I had been told that the only real hope to get Governor Wilder to act on this case was to get to his political guru, this man who lived in the shadows, but a man with whom only the governor, who was the only one who had the governor's ear, I suppose one might say, in terms of what was politically feasible, not legal, but politically feasible. And after many, many calls, I finally got through to this man and arranged a meeting. He had set up a meeting for us in a motel in, I believe, Richmond, as I recall. Go to a certain room. The lawyer and I went to the room, sat in this darkened room with this man, and laid out the case for him and what we wanted him to do. And he wouldn't commit himself. And I remember Rick, my friend, the lawyer, and I were trying to figure out how to get some kind of statement from this guy that he would do what we wanted him to do, which is simply ask the governor to look at the evidence and stop this killing. And Rick took a leaf out of the, I believe it was the story of Watergate, and he said, look, if you don't want to say anything for fear that we've got tapes or something of the, that we're wired, that we have evidence, that we can present evidence if you say something, simply do the following. If you agree with us, stand up. If you don't agree with us, stay seated. And he didn't move. So we didn't know whether he was agreeing with us or not. And then he said, goodbye. And we got up and walked out of the room. It was one of those things that happens in the movies, but it doesn't happen in life. And here it was happening in life, and it was about a potential death. And we were just brokenhearted at the fact that we hadn't been able to get this guy to acknowledge the possibility that Joe was innocent. So, as I said, I was with Joe just a few hours before he was scheduled to be executed. And we were talking about the strategies, the possibilities. We thought we had made some headway with the governor's legal counsel, official legal counsel, in private meetings. We just didn't know, but it was getting down to the end. And I had to say goodbye to Joe. And we met around a table. We, the lawyers, and Marie and I and Joe met around a table in this sub-basement of the Virginia's execution chamber. And I remember one of the lawyers saying to Joe, "Tell Mike about the table we were sitting on." I said, "What's that?" And Joe said, "Oh, this is the cooling table." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Once I'm electrocuted, 2 guards with asbestos gloves, my body will be so hot, the 2 guards with asbestos gloves will carry me out and lay me out on this table so my body can cool before they bury me." I thought, how incredibly inhumane this whole process is. And I should say, too, there were, I think, 1 or 2 other men in the holding area waiting for execution. And Joe was trying to be encouraging to them, even as his number was up, so to speak. Well, I flew home in tears, and the next day got a call from Marie saying that just hours before he was to be executed, Governor Wilder had stopped the execution with an order of commutation. I was, of course, emotionally overwrought by this time after having spent years involving myself with this case, and Marie even longer and more dedicated and more so. But the governor gave us what I think of as half a loaf. What we had asked for, what the lawyer that I had brought into the case contrived, was the opportunity for Joe to agree to a new trial, for the governor to vacate the conviction, force a new trial. And Joe said, "I will stand on whatever the jury decides," which I thought was incredibly fair and courageous of him. But instead of that, the governor said, "I will simply commute this sentence from death to life with parole." And at that time, it was, I believe, 25 years. So Joe would have had to spend another, after having spent, I don't know how many years at that point, 11 or 12, he'd have to spend another 25 years in prison for a crime the governor was acknowledging it was possible that he didn't commit. And he was leaving the issue of the new trial up to the Attorney General of the state at that time. Mary Sue Terry was her name. And as is the case with attorneys general, they don't want to admit that their office or they have made mistakes. So she said, absolutely not, there will be no new trial. So what we knew was that Joe's life had been spared. What we also knew was that he was condemned to spend at least the next quarter of a century in prison before there was any possibility that he would have the opportunity for parole, which we thought was just insane. But it was, as I say, half a loaf. After Joe was commuted, 2 things happened to complicate the case. One was the system hated him. He had beaten the system from the perspective of a lot of people who were part of it. He was supposed to be dead, and he wasn't. And many people hated that. The other was inside the inside the prison system. The members, the convicts, thought that perhaps he was a snitch. Somehow that word got out. My assumption is somebody in the authorities, in the rank of the authorities, put out word that he was a snitch, and that's how he got his sentence commuted. Whatever the case, he was a target. He was targeted by the officers in the guard, in the guards in the system, and also by some of the prisoners who felt that he was unworthy of their friendship. So Joe survived barely. There were a couple of attacks. One night he was stabbed by another inmate. But he survived, and he had made some friends over time in the years he was in prison, and they began to make the case for Joe and say that this is not a snitch, this is not a bad guy, this is somebody who's decent, who's thoughtful, who's careful, who has helped. There were any number of instances where Joe had come to the aid of other inmates, and in particular, Joe became quite extraordinarily well-versed in the law, and he began to help people with their cases. So he was moved from one prison to another, and finally to a little place in northwestern Virginia called Augusta, where I visited him. My wife and I visited him actually a number of times, and our relationship continued to grow. I got to know the warden there. I got to know the chief, officer of the guards, who were very, very actually appreciative of Joe because he was a calming influence. And there in Augusta, he started a program of which I was a founding member, as was Marie and as was Colin McCarthy. I forgot his name. I'm sorry. Suddenly, all of a columnist for the Washington Post. An organization intending to kind of get people to become a little more aware of alternatives to violence in their lives. And he was teaching about Martin Luther King and about Mahatma Gandhi and about peacemakers in the world and about how it is that people can overcome destructive, violent impulses and become better human beings. These are people in prison, and he was doing very well. And I think the people at the prison, both the staff and the inmates, really appreciated Joe and appreciated the work he was doing and appreciated how much value there was in it. Subsequent to that, there was a change in administrations, and the Department of Corrections brought in a new head, somebody I believe from Texas, a horrific system in Texas. And there is a kind of, what should I say, there's a kind of reluctance on the part of departments of corrections to accept the fact that an inmate program might be more beneficial to the inmates than a system program. Joe's program was having such a positive effect that they decided that he was a bad influence. So this particular head of the Department of Corrections saw to it that Joe was taken out of prison and sent to Utah in an interstate compact system that's possible in the United States, where prisoners can be moved from one state to another. Joe was, in the middle of the night, Joe was put on the governor's private plane and flown to Utah. And the head of the corrections department then claimed that he was an instigator of trouble and that he was a bad influence and that he was a murderer and all these other terrible things. And that he was a disruption to the system, so he had to be gotten out of the system. And he would never be back in Virginia. So Joe then went to Utah. I had some friends in Utah, and they, at the ACLU, actually went up to the prison where he was kept, a terrible, awful place, and tried to make sure that he was being well cared for. But this particular prison was such a grotesque place that they used something called the devil's chair, which is a device in which men were strapped helpless for long periods of time as a punishment if they acted out inappropriately. And there were legal constraints as to how long they could be kept in the devil's chair. And Joe, in fact, saw its abuse and filed a complaint with the federal authorities. And the federal authorities were looking at it, I believe, at the time a man died in the devil's chair. So Joe was once again seen as disruptive to the system, targeted by the system. My understanding is the federal authorities either shut down that prison or at least got rid of the people who were running it. And Joe was transferred from there to Joliet, Illinois, infamous Joliet prison, where I visited him at a later point. At that point, he was considering going on a hunger strike, and he said he wanted to get back to Virginia. I went in and talked to the warden. The warden said he was a good man, he was a decent guy, he was thoughtful, he was no trouble to the system, he was from their perspective, a good con. I thought, Joe, God bless you. I'm happy to see that you're alive and well. If not completely well, he was suffering from, I think, hepatitis at the time. But I had no serious consideration that he was going to be successful in getting himself transferred back to Virginia, which is what he wanted. He said that's where effectively his family, Marie, he thought of as his mother, and the lawyers who had, all of us who had been involved in the case, and many of them from Virginia. He said that's where my home is, where my family is. And so I left him in Joliet thinking, good luck, pal. At least you're alive. And the next thing I knew, he was transferred back to Virginia, much to the dismay of the Virginia authorities, who said that he would never be seen, he would never see Virginia again. Joe has an ability to circumvent problems in a system. He has the intelligence and he has the legal knowledge to find ways to do these things, and I find it stunning. And most of it, except in the case where he's trying to get himself back into Virginia, most of that knowledge and ability he uses on behalf of other inmates, which is also a quite extraordinary aspect of his personality, and another aspect of why some people in the system don't like him. They fear him, I think. So when he was sent back to Virginia essentially against the wishes of the Virginia authorities, they put him in their Supermax, Red Onion State Prison, which is a place with the most grievous kinds of restrictions on the rights and opportunities for inmates. Here was a guy who was no danger to anybody, and everybody understood that, but he was being punished by being put in their Supermax at Red Onion. So again, I saw Joe at Red Onion, a man I had begun to feel not only extraordinary connection with, but great affection for, and great admiration for what he had done, what he had managed to do both at Augusta and before that at Mecklenburg, and in Utah, and effectively in Illinois as well, in Joliet, because his work was always geared toward helping other inmates. So here he was in this awful set of circumstances. I got to visit him, but it was glass, I guess, or plexiglass separating us. There was no contact. The guards were respectful of him, I thought, but not. They were, it's a very, very high security place, and he just simply didn't belong there. So again, we were trying all this time to work with new governors, work with parole boards, work with whomever we could find, work with the people who had been on the staff of Governor Wilder's office when he was governor, to no avail. Finally, Joe was transferred to a slightly less secure prison, Wallens Ridge State Prison. where I've visited him a few times now. And again, he has demonstrated his worthiness, he's demonstrated his integrity and his intelligence to the point that the authorities rely on him in many instances to help with problem inmates. But he is also, because of the fact that he has these gifts and because of the fact that he works out well for people, he becomes a target. He was attacked again at Wallen's Ridge and suffered seriously from a fall as a result of a man attacking him. We communicate regularly by mail. I'm hoping the new electronic facilities will allow for communication on a more frequent basis. I've tried very hard to do everything I can to see to it that people understand the case. And we had what I thought was an opportunity with a Democratic governor, Tim Kaine, who was elected governor of Virginia. Tim Kaine demonstrated in the past as a criminal defense attorney a willingness to understand that the death penalty wasn't of benefit to our society, and in fact had defended some people on death row and had worked with Marie Deans, so we thought that there was an in. I met his father-in-law. We had opportunities to get information to him and worked up a petition that was quite extraordinary in that we demonstrated in this petition that Joe would have, if he was released, he would have a place to live, he would have a job, he would have counseling, he would have all the support he would need in order to be a constructive citizen, a productive citizen. And we went to the governor in the last year, I guess, of his term in the hope that he would commute the sentence of Joe, free him in some form or another. We would love to have had him pardoned, but at a minimum have him paroled so that he could be out from behind the walls and be a productive citizen. He would be able to work as a legal aid to in a lawyer's office. He would be able to use his talents to the benefit of society. And I met with a couple of members of Congress, this lawyer I mentioned earlier and a couple of lawyers and I met with a number of members of Congress and got support from them. We got a tremendous amount of support for Joe's petition for the governor's consideration and waited. And there were meetings that had been had by the governor's chief aides and what have you with some of the people who were working on our side of this effort. And I have to say we were very hopeful, only to be dashed, have our hopes dashed, to be disillusioned, to be disappointed by what I view as political cowardice, this extraordinarily frustrating inability of politicians to see that what is right is worth pursuing rather than what is beneficial to their own careers. Then Governor Kaine had for himself in mind a political career, and he didn't want to take the opportunity to allow the chance to make a mistake, so he refused to honor our petition, and he left Joe in prison. And he went on to head the Democratic Party and is now a senator from Virginia, and has not been helpful to the case at all. So we are still trying to maintain Joe's spirits, to put together petitions for the current governor, to put together petitions for relief for Joe, to get him moved into a situation where he's in less secure surroundings so he can be more comfortable, that he can continue to be productive. There's an innocent man who has now been in prison for over 30 years for a crime he didn't commit. And it is sickening that our system tolerates such a thing, and that the politics of injustice, the politics of the unjust justice system are such that this man languishes behind bars while you and I remain free in a system that is supposed to be dedicated to the idea that all people are created equal and that only the truly guilty are separated from society. So anything you can do to help move this case into the mind's eye of people in your country, people in whatever country you happen to live in, certainly people in the United States, would be beneficial. Joe Giarratano is a good man, a fine man, my friend, an innocent man, and he deserves to be free.